The Arizona sun has a weight to it. It's not just heat, it's a physical presence that presses down on your shoulders, bleaches the color from everything, and silences the world in the middle of the day. That silence was why I'd moved here. After 25 years of designing and stress testing municipal water systems in loud, crowded cities, I wanted a place where the only sound was the buzz of a cicada and the gentle trickle of my own creation. My pool wasn't the typical rectangle of blinding blue chlorine you see in every other backyard. It was my masterpiece, a natural swimming pond, filtered by reeds and gravel, bordered by smooth river stones and desert-friendly plants. It was a self-sustaining little ecosystem, cool and clear, a testament to the idea that you could work with nature, not against it. It had taken me a year to build, and every time I looked at it, I felt a deep, quiet pride. That afternoon, the silence was broken by the rusty squeal of my side gate. I didn't have any appointments. Nobody just drops by out here. I sat up in my lounge chair, shielding my eyes, and saw two figures walking onto my property like they owned it. The first was a woman in her late 40s, dressed in crisp white linen pants and a beige top that probably cost more than my monthly water bill. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and she had the kind of tight, pursed lip smile that isn't a smile at all. If you're watching Karenology, you already know this type. This was Karen, the newly elected president of our Homeowners Association. The second figure was a man in a dusty work shirt with Henderson Construction stitched over the pocket. He was thick-set, with a permanent squint and a grease-stained baseball cap pulled low. "Jane Stone?" Karen asked, though it wasn't a question. Her voice cut through the heat like a shard of glass. "I am," I said, not moving from my chair. "And you're on my property." She ignored that. Her eyes scanned my pool with theatrical disgust. "That's the issue. We've had complaints about this pond." Before I could even respond, Henderson unhooked a heavy-duty measuring tape from his belt. Without a word, he started walking toward my house, the metal tape zipping out behind him with a sharp, metallic hiss. He was measuring the distance from my back door to the edge of the water. There's a special kind of violation you feel when a stranger starts taking measurements of your home without your permission. Have you ever felt that? That cold fury that rises in your chest when someone just walks over your boundaries? "What do you think you're doing?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "We're documenting a code violation," Karen said, pulling a clipboard from under her arm. "This unapproved body of water is a clear breach of community covenants. Not to mention, it constitutes non-essential water use during a drought." I finally stood up. I'm not a large woman, but I've spent enough time on construction sites to know how to stand my ground. This is a closed-loop recirculating system. It uses less water than the patch of grass you have in your front yard, and it's a pool, not a pond. Karen gave a little sniff. A pool, by definition, has a chemical filtration system. This is a stagnant body of water, a breeding ground for mosquitoes, a liability. Henderson grunted in agreement from my porch, scribbling a number on a notepad. Then came the punch. Karen held out a single sheet of paper. "This is a formal notice. You're being fined $10,000 by the association. $5,000 for the unapproved structure, and $5,000 for creating a potential threat to neighborhood property foundations due to soil saturation." $10,000. The number just hung in the shimmering air. This wasn't about a pool. This was a shakedown. I felt a familiar, metallic taste in my mouth, the taste of institutional bullying I thought I'd left behind. My hand drifted down to my hip, where I sometimes clipped my favorite tool when I was working outside. It was a habit. It wasn't there, but I could almost feel the phantom weight of it, my father's old torque wrench. Heavy steel, with his motto faintly engraved on the handle: "Measure twice, cut once." It was a rule for mechanics, for engineers, for life. These people hadn't measured anything. They had just decided to cut. If you've ever been backed into a corner by someone with a clipboard and a crooked smile, you know the feeling. If this story is hitting home, go ahead and hit that like button, because believe me, this was just the first shot in a war I never even wanted to fight. I took the paper from her. My hand was steady. "You're making a big mistake," I told her, looking her straight in the eye. She just smiled that non-smile again. "I don't think so." She turned to leave, Henderson following like a loyal bulldog. Then she stopped at the gate and looked back over her shoulder, a final parting shot. "Oh, and for the record, "We've already notified the county water board. You should be expecting a visit." She turned and walked away, the gate squealing shut behind her, leaving that final threat hanging in the blistering air. A visit from the county. In this part of Arizona, with water rights being a sensitive, almost sacred topic, that wasn't a small thing. It was like sicking the IRS on someone. They could tie you up in hearings and paperwork for years, draining your bank account and your will to live, all while your property withered under the sun. For a long moment, I just stood there, the ridiculous $10,000 fine fluttering in my hand. The smart play would have been to panic, to start draining the pool, write an apology letter, beg for forgiveness. But panic isn't in my nature. You don't last 2 decades as the only woman on a dozen different engineering crews by panicking. You get methodical. That evening, I didn't pour a drink. I made a pot of coffee and spread out the original blueprints for my pool on the dining room table. I cross-referenced them with every county building code and water conservation statute I could find online. I'd done this a dozen times before I even broke ground, but I did it again. My system was flawless. It was over-engineered, if anything. It had a multi-stage filtration system that used a fraction of the energy of a standard pump, and its evaporation rate was lower than a public park sprinkler system. Legally, they didn't have a leg to stand on. 2 days later, a dusty county-issued sedan pulled up to my curb. A man got out. He was tall, thin, and moved with a kind of weary indifference. He wore a gray short-sleeve button-down shirt that was already showing dark patches of sweat under the arms. He didn't introduce himself, just grunted something that sounded like Adam's water board and walked right past me toward the pool. He didn't have a clipboard. He had a small, beat-up notepad and a pen. He walked one slow circle around the water, his eyes scanning everything but revealing nothing. I tried to explain the recirculating pump, the gravel bed filter. I pointed out the native plants that helped clean the water. He just nodded, his face blank, and made a single cryptic note. "Is there a problem, Inspector?" I finally asked. He stopped and looked at me for the first time. His eyes were pale and tired. "I just look at things, ma'am. Someone else decides if there's a problem." And with that, he turned, walked back to his car, and drove away. The entire visit lasted less than 5 minutes. It was the strangest, most unnerving inspection I'd ever witnessed. It didn't feel like an inspection. It felt like a formality. The other shoe dropped on a Friday. It came in a stiff, official-looking envelope. The logo of the County Water and Land Use Department was in the top left corner. My hands felt cold as I tore it open. It was a formal notice of violation. It stated that my unregistered residential water feature was in breach of Clause 7B of the Arid Zone Residential Code. I knew the codebook back to front. I had no idea what Clause 7B was. The notice didn't bother to explain it. And then I saw the number at the bottom of the page, a civil penalty of $15,000. On top of the $10,000 from the Homeowners Association, I was now looking at a $25,000 hole. Have you ever been so angry you felt perfectly calm? That's where I was. I was standing in my kitchen, staring at a piece of paper that was trying to ruin me, and all I could feel was a cold, quiet rage. This wasn't about water. It was about power. And Mr. Adams, the ghost inspector, had been nothing more than the weapon. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept going over it in my head, the smug look on Karen's face, Henderson's silent measuring, the dead eyes of the inspector. I walked out to the patio. The moon was a bright white sliver in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. And that's when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic hissing sound. It wasn't the cicadas. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from the far side of the pool, near the filter housing. I walked over, my bare feet silent on the cool flagstones. The hissing grew louder, and then I saw it. A dark, wet patch spreading out from the base of the pool wall, soaking into the dry, thirsty ground. The water level was lower. I could see the waterline mark on the stones, a good 2 inches above the current surface. My perfect sealed system had a leak, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, this was no accident. The ground around the damp spot looked disturbed, freshly turned, a dark wound in the pale desert soil under the moonlight. The ground was soft under my fingertips, too soft. I'd spent months compacting this soil myself. I knew its texture, its density. This was different. It was loose, crumbly. Someone had been digging here. The realization hit me like a physical blow. They hadn't just used bureaucracy and regulations to come after me. They had physically sabotaged my property. Kneeling there in the dark, the scent of wet earth, and my own blooming dread filling the air, I felt a shift inside me. This had just escalated from a dispute into an attack. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was a violation on a whole new level. What do you do when you realize the game has no rules? When you know your opponents are willing to break the law to break you? The next morning, the proof of their next move was in my mailbox. It was another letter from the Homeowners Association, this one printed on cheerful, high-quality paper. It expressed deep concern over the newly discovered structural instability of my pool. It went on to say that, as a gesture of goodwill, the board had authorized Henderson Construction to offer me a discounted rate to drain the pool, fill it in, and stabilize the surrounding soil. The letter was signed by Karen. It was a beautiful trap. If I accepted, I was admitting my pool was a problem, justifying their fines and making myself liable for everything. If I refused, they'd paint me as a stubborn fool risking the neighborhood's safety. The leak they created had become their leverage. I crumpled the letter in my fist. The paper was thick and smooth, expensive. They were spending our association dues to destroy me. I spent the day patching the leak. It was a clean puncture, low on the liner, just below the soil line. It looked like someone had driven a piece of rebar or a sharp pipe straight through it. It was professional-grade sabotage. As I worked, my mind raced. I needed proof. I needed something more than my word against theirs. But how do you prove a hole was made maliciously? How do you prove who was standing in your yard in the middle of the night? Just as I was packing up my tools, my phone buzzed. It was an email from my homeowner's insurance company. The subject line was Policy Review Notification. My heart hammered against my ribs. The email was polite, corporate, and terrifying. It stated that due to new information regarding a significant, undeclared liability risk on my property, my policy was under review and might be terminated. They had reported me to my own insurance. They were trying to cut me off at the knees, leaving me completely exposed. I felt a wave of something close to despair wash over me. I'd built my life on being competent, on being in control. Now, every pillar I stood on was being kicked out from under me. I was being attacked on all fronts, regulatory, financial, and now my personal safety net. I walked into my garage, the smell of oil and old tools a familiar comfort. My dad's torque wrench was sitting on the workbench, right where I'd left it. I picked it up. The steel was cool and heavy in my hand. Measured twice, cut once. They weren't measuring, they were just cutting. And I realized they wouldn't stop until there was nothing left of my life here. That's when Ben, my neighbor's kid, appeared at the open garage door. He was a lanky 16-year-old who was always tinkering with something. Today, it was a drone. "Hey, Miss Stone," he said, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "My mom said you were having some trouble with the Homeowners Association." I managed a weak smile. "You could say that." He held up his drone controller. "I don't know if this helps, but I was flying my drone yesterday morning, testing the new camera. I have some footage of your yard from, right after sunrise." He hesitated. "There's a weird patch of dirt by your pool. It wasn't there the day before." My breath caught in my throat. I looked from the kid's earnest face to the drone in his hand. "Ben," I said, my voice hoarse, "show me." He nodded, and as he powered up the controller, a familiar figure appeared down the street, making his way from house to house. It was Frank, our mailman, his bag slung over his shoulder, a small packet of letters in his hand. Ben's drone buzzed to life, lifting into the air with a high-pitched whine. On the small screen of his controller, my backyard came into view, a bird's-eye map of my problems. He zoomed in on the pool, and there it was. A dark, ugly scar of freshly disturbed earth, right where I'd found the puncture. It was undeniable. The image was time-stamped, 6:15 a.m., the day after the ghost inspector had visited. "See," Ben said, pointing a skinny finger at the screen. "It looks like someone was digging." As I stared at the digital proof, Frank the mailman trudged up my driveway. He was in his late 50s, with a kind, weathered face and the steady, unhurried pace of a man who has walked the same route for 20 years. He handed me a few bills and a circular. "Looks like you got another love letter from the county," he said, nodding at the official envelope I still had in my hand from the other day. "Something like that," I sighed, showing him the front. "Ever heard of an inspector named Adams?" Frank squinted at the return address. Adams, you know, it's funny you say that. He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. That's Henderson's brother-in-law, the contractor guy. Married his wife's sister last spring. Small world, huh? He chuckled, tapped the side of his nose, and continued on his route. The world didn't feel small, it felt suffocating. The drone footage, the mailman's comment, the pieces were clicking into place. This wasn't just corruption, it was a family affair. Henderson wanted a contract, and his brother-in-law, the inspector, was creating the violations to justify it. Karen was the public face, the muscle. It was a neat, tidy, and utterly illegal little operation. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. A grainy drone photo and a mailman's gossip wouldn't hold up anywhere. The next evening, Karen and Henderson held a special emergency community meeting in the clubhouse. They had advertised it as a presentation on protecting our property values and ensuring neighborhood safety. It was a masterpiece of fear-mongering. Henderson stood in front of a giant projector screen, displaying terrifying-looking diagrams of cracked foundations and sinking homes, all hypothetically caused by uncontrolled ground saturation. He never mentioned my name, but he didn't have to. Everyone knew who he was talking about. He then unveiled his grand solution, Project Water Shield, a $2 million proposal to excavate and replace the main water lines for the entire neighborhood. He claimed the existing pipes were old, and that my leaking pond was the final straw that was about to cause a catastrophic failure. It's a ticking time bomb, he said, his voice grave. Then Karen took the floor. She announced that to fund the project, a special assessment would be levied on every homeowner. But, she added with a magnanimous smile, she had negotiated a deal. If I, the source of the problem, would publicly endorse the project and agree to have my pond removed as the first step, Henderson would give me a generous discount on my share of the work. It was a public execution. They were trying to force me to bless their scam in front of all my neighbors. Have you ever been put on the spot like that, with a dozen pairs of eyes on you, waiting for you to surrender? I stood up. The room fell silent. No, I said. My voice didn't shake. I will not. A murmur went through the crowd. My one supposed ally on the board, a quiet man named George, whom I'd always thought was reasonable, stood up. I expected him to defend me. Instead, he turned to the room. Folks, I think we need to be practical here. We can't let one person's stubbornness put all our homes at risk. I say we approve the project and move forward. The betrayal was swift and absolute. He wasn't my ally, he was just another one of them, scared for his property value. The vote was a landslide. The project was approved. As people started filing out, pulling out their checkbooks to pay the initial deposit, they shot me looks of pure venom. I wasn't just the problem anymore. I was the selfish lunatic who was going to cost them all a fortune. I had never felt so completely and utterly alone. I walked out of that clubhouse with my head held high, but inside, I felt like my own foundation was cracking. The next few days were a special kind of hell. The neighborhood chat group, which used to be for lost dogs and barbecue invitations, became a firestorm of accusations directed at me. I was selfish, irresponsible, a menace. People I'd shared friendly waves with now crossed the street to avoid me. My car got egged one night. Someone threw a bag of garbage onto my lawn. It was a coordinated campaign of low-grade psychological warfare, and it was working. I started to feel like a prisoner in my own home. The deposits for Henderson's Project Water Shield were pouring in. Karen sent out a triumphant email blast. Over $200,000 collected in the first 72 hours. It was a stampede of fear. Henderson's victory seemed absolute. He had the contract, he had the community's backing, and he had me right where he wanted me, isolated and demonized. I spent hours in my garage, staring at the blueprints and the county codes, feeling like I was trapped in a nightmare. Every logical path was blocked. Legal action would take months, years even, and cost a fortune I didn't have. The authorities were compromised. The community was against me. It felt like trying to fight a flood with a teaspoon. There's a point in any fight where you have to decide if it's still worth fighting. A moment where the cost, not in money, but in peace, in sanity, seems too high. I was at that point. I sat on a stool, surrounded by the ghosts of 1,000 solved problems, my tools, wrenches that had tightened bolts on city water mains, gauges that had measured pressure in hydroelectric dams. They were instruments of order and logic, but they were useless against this kind of chaos. I picked up my father's torque wrench again. The inscription, "Measure twice, cut once," felt like a mockery. I hadn't measured the people right. I had assumed they operated on facts and reason. What a fool I'd been. And that's when it hit me. The thought was so simple, so fundamental, I couldn't believe I'd missed it. I had been so focused on defending my pool, on proving my innocence. I was playing their game. But what if the game wasn't about my pool at all? Henderson wasn't just trying to get a $2 million contract. He was trying to dig. He wanted a legitimate reason to tear up the neighborhood's plumbing. But why? What was he so desperate to get to? Or to hide? I remembered his face at the meeting when he talked about the old pipes. He wasn't just selling fear, he was nervous. I'd seen that look before on contractors who were about to have their shoddy work inspected. He kept rubbing his left arm, a nervous tic. He was hiding something. I pulled out the original plat maps for the development, the ones I'd downloaded from the county archives months ago. They showed the layout of all the utilities, laid out in neat, precise lines. The main water lines for our loop had been installed about 10 years ago. I checked the contractor of record, Henderson Construction, of course. This wasn't about a new problem. This was about an old one. He wasn't trying to prevent a catastrophe. He was trying to bury his own mistakes before they came to light. A new kind of energy surged through me. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something colder, sharper. It was the thrill of the hunt. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was an engineer with a puzzle to solve. I had to get proof, but not the kind that came on paper. I needed something physical, something undeniable. I dug out my old ultrasonic scanner, a piece of equipment I used to detect stress fractures in subterranean pipes without excavating. It was heavy, outdated, but it still worked. That night, after the last light in the neighborhood had gone out, I slipped out of my house. The streets were empty, silent. I felt like a spy in my own neighborhood, my scanner in a duffel bag slung over my shoulder. I started at the main junction, following the path of the pipes as laid out on the plat map. I pressed the scanner to the ground, listening to the electronic pings through my headphones. Ping, ping, a steady rhythm. The pipes were where they were supposed to be, for a while. Then, about 3 houses down from mine, the rhythm changed. The pings became fainter, higher pitched. The pipe was shallower than the code specified, much shallower. I kept going, block by block, a silent ghost taking the measure of the secrets buried beneath my neighbor's perfect lawns. And the data was all the same. The pipes were too shallow, laid in trenches that were likely not deep enough, a cost-cutting measure that was also a ticking time bomb of potential leaks and breaks. Henderson hadn't built a water system. He'd installed a liability, and now he was about to get everyone to pay him to cover it up. I saved the readings, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the steady ping of the scanner. This was the key. Now I just had to figure out how to turn it. I had the data, a damning set of ultrasonic readings that painted a clear picture of Henderson's original sin. But data is just numbers on a screen. To people who had already paid a deposit to make the problem go away, it would just look like more technical nonsense from the crazy lady with the swamp in her backyard. I needed to make it real. I needed a stage. The next morning, I saw a flyer tacked to the community notice board. The Homeowners Association was hosting its annual Neighborhood Safety Fair that coming Saturday. There would be a fire truck for the kids to climb on, a booth from the local sheriff's office, and free hot dogs. And featured prominently in the center of the flyer was the Project Water Shield information booth, where residents could ask questions and, of course, make their final payments. It was a victory lap for Karen and Henderson. It was also the perfect stage. I spent the next 2 days preparing. I felt a focus I hadn't felt in years, the old instincts kicking in. I called the one person I thought might listen, Maria, a retired insurance underwriter who lived on the next street over. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had her own run-in with the board over the color of her fence a few years back. I didn't give her all the details. I just told her I had uncovered evidence of potential contractor fraud that could affect the entire neighborhood's insurance eligibility, and that I was going to present it at the fair. I asked her if she knew anyone from her old world who specialized in contractor liability and performance bonds. She made a call. Then I went back to my garage. I cleaned and calibrated my dad's torque wrench. It was a precision instrument designed to apply a specific amount of force, no more, no less. In engineering, standards are everything. They are the invisible rules that keep bridges from falling and pipes from bursting. Henderson had cut corners on depth. I had a gut feeling he'd cut corners on everything else, too. The day of the fair was bright and hot. The central green of the neighborhood was buzzing with people. Kids were laughing, music was playing from a small speaker, and the smell of grilled hot dogs filled the air. It was a perfect picture of suburban harmony. In the middle of it all was Henderson's booth, a large, professional-looking setup with a banner that read, "Securing Our Future Together." Karen stood beside him, beaming, shaking hands like a politician on election day. I walked up to the booth. A few people noticed me and fell silent, nudging their neighbors. Karen's smile tightened when she saw me. "Jane," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Have you come to your senses? It's not too late to sign up." "I have a few questions first," I said, my voice carrying in the sudden lull. I turned to Henderson. "You've been talking a lot about these new pipes, about how safe and reliable they'll be. You're a man who believes in standards, right?" Henderson puffed out his chest. "Only the best, top-of-the-line materials, everything to code." "Good," I said. "Then you'll be familiar with the D25 flange joint specification for pressurized water mains. It's the industry standard." I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't recognition. It was fear. I wasn't holding a file of papers. I was holding the torque wrench. It felt heavy and solid in my hand. The D25 spec requires a torque of 120 Newton meters on the flange bolts to ensure a proper seal under pressure. It prevents the kind of long-term leaks you've been scaring everyone with. I pointed to the main water access panel set in the grass 20 feet away. "That's the main shutoff for this whole loop. Your company installed it 10 years ago. Why don't we do a live test, a little demonstration of the quality workmanship we can expect from Project Water Shield?" A crowd was gathering now. They could smell blood in the water. Henderson started to bluster. "That's ridiculous. We can't just open up the main—" "Why not?" I said, my voice ringing out across the lawn. "It's a simple test. If your original work was up to standard, it will prove you're a contractor we can trust. If not—" I let the sentence hang in the air. Karen tried to intervene, her face turning a blotchy red. "This is highly irregular. This is not the time or place." But it was too late. A man in a sharp suit had stepped forward from the back of the crowd. "I think it's an excellent idea," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "My name is David Chen. I'm a senior investigator for the firm that underwrites Mr. Henderson's performance bond." Maria, standing near the back, gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was set. Henderson looked like he'd seen a ghost. His entire future, his $2 million payday, was about to be decided by a single bolt. All eyes were on Henderson. He was trapped. Refusing the test would be an admission of guilt. Agreeing to it felt like walking his own plank. The crowd was silent, the smell of hot dogs forgotten. This was the real entertainment. David Chen, the man from the bonding company, stood with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask of professional curiosity. He was here because of Maria's call. He was the embodiment of the financial consequences Henderson had never thought would arrive. With a shaky hand, Henderson nodded to one of his crew members, who reluctantly fetched a large key and opened the heavy iron plate of the water main access. It revealed a series of large pipes and valves. I pointed to a specific flange joint, the one connecting the main line to our neighborhood's loop. "That one," I said. I knelt on the grass, the torque wrench feeling like a natural extension of my arm. I fitted the socket over one of the large rusted bolts. 120 Newton meters, I announced to the crowd, setting the dial on the wrench with a series of loud, satisfying clicks. "That's the standard. If this bolt was tightened correctly, the wrench will click without the bolt turning any further. If it was under-tightened, it will turn until it reaches the correct torque. And if it was over-tightened—" I took a breath and pulled on the wrench. There was no movement, no groan of stressed metal, nothing. Instead, the instant I applied pressure, the wrench gave a loud, sharp click. Henderson let out a relieved sigh. A few of his supporters in the crowd murmured, "See? Nothing." I didn't stand up. I stayed kneeling, a small smile playing on my lips. "You're right," I said, looking up at Henderson. "It didn't move. But you all heard that click, right? I looked around at the faces in the crowd. They nodded. That click means the bolt is already tightened at least to 120 Newton meters. Or maybe... I adjusted the dial on the wrench again, this time down to 80. Another series of clicks echoed in the quiet. Let's try 80, that's well below spec. If the bolt is torqued correctly, it shouldn't click at all. I pulled again. Click. The crowd gasped. Henderson's face went white. He knew what I had just done. I had just proven the bolt was grossly over-tightened. In a desperate attempt to stop leaks caused by cheap gaskets, his crew had cranked the bolts down so hard they had crushed the seals, creating the perfect conditions for future failure. It was the engineering equivalent of using a sledgehammer to fix a watch. It was a cover-up, plain and simple. "You didn't use the right gaskets, did you, Mr. Henderson?" I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "You used cheap ones, and when they leaked during the initial pressure test 10 years ago, you had your crew torque these bolts down until the leaking stopped. You didn't fix the problem, you just buried it. This whole Project Water Shield isn't about saving our homes. It's about you getting paid $2 million to dig up and hide the evidence of your own fraud before the warranties expired." I stood up and looked directly at David Chen. An over-torqued flange is a primary breach of contract specifications. It voids the warranty and is grounds for an immediate claim against his performance bond. Chen nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Henderson. "Indeed it is." He pulled out his phone. "Mr. Henderson, I suggest you don't leave town. Your bond is hereby frozen, pending a full forensic audit of this entire development." The fight went out of Henderson in an instant. He sagged, a puppet with his strings cut. Karen stood beside him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, but no sound coming out. The crowd just stared, the truth dawning on them. They hadn't been protecting their homes. They had been willingly fleeced. My neighbors looked at me, not with admiration, but with a kind of dawning, horrified respect. I hadn't just won an argument, I had blown up their comfortable reality. In the end, Henderson Construction went bankrupt. The bond company paid for a complete and proper replacement of the water lines. Karen was voted out of the Homeowners Association in a landslide of angry proxy votes. I got my $25,000 in fines refunded, along with a formal, written apology from the new board. They even offered me a lucrative contract to oversee the repair work. I turned it down. I didn't want their money. I didn't want to be their savior. I suggested they form a citizen oversight committee instead, and offered to advise them for free. I won. By every metric, I won. But as I sit here tonight by my perfect silent pool, I know I lost something too. I'm not the neighborhood menace anymore. I'm the woman who was right, the woman who saw the truth when no one else would. And that's a lonely thing to be. They respect me now. But they don't invite me to their barbecues. I saved them from a crook, but I shattered their peace of mind. And sometimes, I think they'll never forgive me for that. I picked up my dad's wrench from the workbench and wiped it clean, the cool steel a familiar weight in my hand. "Measure twice, cut once," I murmured to the empty garage. I had measured them all, and in the end, I had made the cut. It was the right thing to do. It was the only thing to do. But I guess some victories just feel a lot like being alone.